So the Knoxville History Project, our mission is very simple, is to research, preserve, and promote the history of Knoxville, Tennessee. And this series is supported by many of our supporters of the Knoxville History Project, but particularly Council members Lynn Fugate and Charlie Thomas are particularly underwriting this virtual series. So thank you to you. I'm going to hand it over to Jack Neely, Executive Director of the Knoxville History Project, and he's got a few words for you this evening. So thank you.
Thanks. I have very few words. We're grateful to be here at Blount Mansion. There's believe it or not, in the capital that was called Knoxville in the 1790s. It had been the capital of the Southwestern Territory, was soon to be the capital of Tennessee. It was once described as a place, a city of 200 to 300 houses, and there's only one of them still standing today, and that's Blount Mansion. And there's not a better place to talk about the birth of Tennessee. And it had actually had a good deal to do with those early days in that constitutional convention in 1796. But without further ado, I'm going to yield the floor to our friend Magra.
Thank you, Jeff. It's kind of hard to follow someone who's got a room named after them. Congratulations on that. Welcome to Blount Mansion. I'm going to stop this screen share and get ready to bring our speakers. My name is Michael Jordan, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Development here at Blount Mansion. And we're super excited because this is our first ever hybrid event. We see that while things are opening up, that Zoom is with us to stay, as are WebEx and Microsoft Teams and whatever other platform you are cursed to have to use at work every day. So we had a donor that provided us the ability to build in this hybrid capability in our exhibit hall here. And we'll be doing, for the foreseeable future, all of our lecture programs, and even a Rotary Club will meet here every Friday. And we'll have the ability now to actually have speakers join us remotely, or as in the case tonight, folks who are in the Zoom meeting who ask questions verbally, we'll be able to see you and hear you in the room, just as you can see and hear our speakers. So we're really excited about that. As Jack alluded to, Blount Mansion has been here for a very long time. We consider ourselves the birthplace of Tennessee because William Blount, the territorial governor, was the man who took the steps necessary to create a state government. As such, we were proud to be kind of the center of celebrations for the Tennessee 225th birthday this week. On Tuesday, we welcomed somewhere between 300 and 400 people, including Governor Bill Lee and First Lady Maria Lee, Knox County Mayor Glenn Jacobs, and Knoxville Mayor India Kincannon for a parade that went from James White's Fort here to Blount Mansion. And of course, yes, Representative Tim Burchett. My wife is here and she helps me make sure I don't forget important things. It was a great day. We were just thrilled to be able to make that dream come true of having that parade. We've continued throughout the week with other programs. Last night we did a virtual artifact exploration with the Tennessee State History Museum. We talked about the statehood desk that the Tennessee Constitution was signed on in 1796. It's now in Governor Blount's office. And the folks at the State Museum showed us the pocket watch that William Blount gave John Sevier upon the occasion of Tennessee statehood. So we were able to reach audiences all across the state. And tonight we culminate our week-long look at Tennessee statehood and what it means with Dr. Chris Magara talking about Tennessee as a crossroads, about Knoxville specifically as a crossroads. And I've got to say, I think Chris Magara is probably the coolest historian alive today. And there are lots of reasons you might think that. He has a great personality, that's true, but what I think is coolest about him is he researches chocolate and pirates, which is two of my favorite things in the world. He's the author of numerous books. He's also on our board here at Blount Mansion. And the first time we worked with Dr. Magra was when he reviewed our republication of the 1954 biography about William Blount, the only book that's written specifically about William Blount. And his condition was, I'll be glad to review this book as long as you don't expect me to just be all sunshine and roses. I want to give an honest, critical assessment of William Blount's legacy and what he did. And of course, that's what we wanted. And since joining the board, Chris has continued to make sure that in all of our exhibits that we're planning for the blank walls in this room and our publications, that we strike a balance between talking about the great men that we all grew up with and learned about and heard about, but also the voiceless and the marginalized in history to consider how the events that happened here impacted Native Americans, enslaved African Americans, women, children, and to present a more full picture. So I told him that my hope when he came on the board was that he would be our North Star, much like the late Paul Bergeron was, the first academic historian on our board, and he certainly filled that role. So we told people that our event on Tuesday was a party, and the event tonight is for serious historians and history buffs like you. So we're glad you're all here, and without further ado, well, first, I guess I should bring up your PowerPoint, Chris. We have a lot of technology going on here, so bear with us if things are a little bit quirky sometimes. Oops, there we go. Dr. Chris Magara.
Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate that warm introduction. Isn't it nice to be here? Those of us who are here in person, isn't it nice? This is the first public appearance I've had in over a year. Just a few weeks ago was the first party I've been to in a year. It was outside. That was nice. And it's making me nostalgic. It's making me think back the very first time I took my wife on a date. We went to a history lecture and she was still there at the end. So I knew I had something special. Hope that all of you are still there at the end of this lecture. But I do want to thank the Blount Mansion and the Knoxville History Project for hosting this event. The Blount Mansion is a Knoxville treasure, and the Knoxville History Project has done a lot to keep our local history alive and well. Knoxville is a special place. The more we study our local history, the more we can appreciate just how special it is. I also want to thank those in attendance here in the Blount Mansion Visitor Center and those listening in online for coming to the talk today. I love Knoxville. My wife and I moved here 11 years ago. We raised a family in Knoxville. We go to football games here. We go for walks in Sequoia Hills. My daughter loves getting Cruise Farm ice cream on Gay Street. Colette, if you're listening, Daddy loves you. I've had season tickets for Vols basketball games. This is a special city. And the Blount Mansion is a great place to talk about the 225th anniversary of our state. The Blount Mansion is in many ways the birthplace of the state of Tennessee. William Blount led the charge for statehood. The desk on which the original state constitution was signed is in the Blount Mansion, nice and cleaned up. Those of you who had a chance last night to see Dave and Michael talk about the desk and other elements of material culture, both here at the Blount Mansion and in Nashville, you got a chance to see that desk firsthand. And why don't you come down here to Blount Mansion and see it? And Knoxville was the first capital city until 1812, as Jack mentioned earlier. This region has long been a crossroads, and I want you all to look at this map. If you've never thought of Tennessee as a crossroads before, just sit down with a map of the United States of America. Knoxville and Tennessee are centrally located. People have passed through on their way to other destinations, but the region's beautiful, and maybe it's too beautiful. It's long attracted people who wanted to permanently live here, myself included. The region has always been a meeting place because of its geographic location and its natural splendor. Native Americans were the first to live here. Cherokee, Shawnee, Chickasaw, and other indigenous peoples first called this land home. They were the first people to build roads here, to establish settlements here, to hunt and fish here. A variety of indigenous people met and came together in this region. As late as 1762, people living where we are now called this place Cherokee country. How do we get from Cherokee country in 1762 to Tennessee in 1796? I've got a doctoral student right now, Casey Price, who is he will be working on a dissertation on this question. How do we get from Cherokee country to Tennessee? Casey, if you're listening out there, very proud of you. This map helps to explain that process. How do we get from Cherokee country to Tennessee? This is one of the most important early maps of the place we all live in today. How many of you have been to Fort Loudon in here? Raise your hand if you've been to Fort Loudon. Just about everybody. has been there. What a beautiful place. My wife and daughter and I went, and a butterfly landed on my daughter's nose. Can you believe that? I mean, it's like a straight out of a Disney movie. You can see Fort Loudon near the bottom of the map, where the Tellico River meets the Tennessee River. Right there. The map is a little tricky. North is on the left. So if you travel up the map from Fort Loudon, you're actually traveling east across Cherokee country. And if you travel east along the Tennessee River from Fort Loudon on the map, then you come to an interesting note that reads, a fort built by the Virginians in 1756 and soon after destroyed by the Indians. It's right here. It's probably too small for many of you to read here, let alone those of you who are at home. It says a fort built by the Virginians in 1756 and soon after destroyed by the Indians. If you look to the left of this unnamed abandoned fort, then you'll see a road running to Virginia. If you look to the right of the abandoned fort, then you'll see a road running to Charleston, South Carolina. You might call the place where two roads converge a Robert Frost poem, but you could also call it a crossroads. Why did Virginians come to this region? Why did they build a fort? Why did Cherokee people destroy their fort? Why were there roads connecting this region to Virginia and South Carolina to begin with? And why did the British build a fort way out at the confluence of the Tellico and Tennessee rivers? The Cherokee had been living next to English neighbors in Virginia for over 150 years by 1762 when this map was made. The Cherokee had English neighbors in the Carolinas, the Latin form of Charles, since English settlers established Charlestown in 1669. Charles II was a king of England. North and South Carolina then separated in 1712. The Cherokee made an initial compromise and allowed English settlers to trade in Cherokee country. It might be tough for some of you to see, but written on the map is the word Chota. Some of you might be able to see that. Sometimes it's pronounced Chota with an E in front of it. Sometimes it's pronounced Chota with an A at the end of it. It's near the center of the map for a reason. The roads running from Virginia and South Carolina converge on Chota. It was a hub of Cherokee civilization. These were sacred hunting and fishing grounds. These were sacred burial places for Cherokee ancestors. And Cherokee leaders allowed English traders to enter this area to trade in 1673. English traders brought brass cooking implements, European clothing, guns, and ammunition, which they traded for deerskins, beeswax, and river cane baskets. Trade was a compromise for the Cherokee. They had encountered Europeans as early as 1540 with the Spanish expedition of Hernando de Soto. The Cherokee suffered population loss as a direct result of coming in contact with European diseases such as smallpox. By the 1760s, around the time Sequoyah was born, the Cherokee had dwindled to an estimated 7,000 people. The Cherokee did not know European diseases were killing them, but over hundreds of years, they surely realized there was a correlation between contact with Europeans and death. They experienced this correlation firsthand, but the Cherokee compromised and allowed a few traders to bring their wares into the heart of Cherokee country. They made this compromise to try to avoid conflict and to get European goods. So why was there conflict? Why did the Cherokee attack that fort in 1756 at the start of the French and Indian War? The short answer is that Virginia started the French and Indian War in North America. Virginians didn't just want to trade in Indian country. They wanted to develop land, to sell it, and to settle there. The Virginia government sent surveyors like George Washington and Henry Timberlake, our map maker, and members of the Virginia militia all over the backcountry to claim huge amounts of land for Virginia speculators and settlers. Washington went up to western Pennsylvania. Timberlake came to this region in 1756. And look how close Virginians built that fort to Chota, right on the other side of the Tennessee River. Land was important to settlers. Land ownership meant political power and economic freedom to settlers. You could vote and hold elected office if you owned land. Land ownership was also linked to manhood. Real men, respectable men, were said to own land. Land also meant profits to real estate developers who sold homesteads to settlers. For all these reasons, and the fact that the region teemed with beautiful rivers and mountains, people wanted to own land here. This is what brought settlers to this region. Westward expansion and settlement brought on conflict. The Cherokee tried to continue to compromise with settlers. Besides trading with them, the Cherokee signed 10 different treaties with the British government between 1721 and 1777. In each treaty, the Cherokee agreed to allow English settlers to settle on more and more of Cherokee country. Some younger Cherokee fought against this settlement. Some felt the Virginian fort next to Chota was simply too much to bear and they destroyed it. Others attacked Fort Loudon shortly afterwards for similar reasons. Yet there remained enough Cherokee who were committed to compromise. In fact, some Cherokee leaders even traveled all the way to London in 1762 to meet with the King of England to affirm this enduring commitment to compromise. The East Tennessee Historical Society has a nice exhibit on this visit. Encourage you all to check that out. I took this photo when I visited with my family last week. The Cherokee trip to London helped convince King George III to issue his famous proclamation in 1763. Did you all know that, by the way? Those of you in the room, did you know that Cherokee people from this region influenced King George III to pass the proclamation line of 1763? Our region is so important. Need to study our local history. This proclamation, as many of you know, declared all the lands between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River to be one large Indian reservation, with lands the king reserved for their use. A lot of people mistake that proclamation line. I teach on this. I've got a huge soapbox on this, but people want to put King George III up on some humanitarian pedestal and give him a Nobel Peace Prize. He's not giving land to indigenous people. He's reserving it by his authority, and it will remain reserved for them as long as he deems that it should be so. King of England was also primarily compromising with his treasury to prevent costly conflicts with Native Americans. But the 1763 proclamation line meant that settlers couldn't move west. And this caused conflict between the settlers and the British government that helped bring about the American Revolution. The Cherokee and other Native Americans then allied with Great Britain during the Revolution, in no small part because of George III's 1763 Royal Proclamation. The fact that the Cherokee allied with Great Britain only accelerated the impulse among settlers for westward expansion in the wake of the war. And westward expansion always led to conflict. When Americans won their freedom and established the independent United States of America in 1783, the new United States government initially let individual states fight among themselves over enormous amounts of Western lands that were no longer reserved for indigenous people. Sounds crazy, right? How could anybody enter into an area where there's no regulation over land ownership, who can buy and sell property, right? We think of the past as a different distant place. We think of it as the moon populated by aliens. You can't understand these people and their time and day and age. Things were so weird. Us modern folk just can't comprehend it, right? Well, I lived in Los Angeles for 4 years. My wife and I tried to buy a house there, and our realtor told us stories about people having put in offers that got accepted on the same house. And then they had to go to court to have that adjudicated. The Wild West is not dead, I don't think, when it comes to real estate. And man, the real estate market here in Knoxville is crazy these days. I hope nobody out there is trying to buy a home right now. The United States got 900,000 square miles of land. 900,000 square miles of land between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River as a result of the peace treaty that ended the Revolutionary War. What was going to happen to all that land? What was going to happen to the people already living on that land? The lack of federal regulation after the Revolution meant that settlers from different states could claim to own the same Western lands. The absence of federal protocols for owning Western lands meant that anyone could go out west and start their own state if they wanted to. Who would want to do that? On August 23rd, 1784, 50 men signed a document in Jonesboro declaring their independence from North Carolina. North Carolina claimed the region we live in today. Virginia lost its claims to this area. Then North Carolina decided to give the land to the United States government to pay off Rev War debts. Then North Carolina changed direction and said they wanted to keep the land after all. Settlers in the area wanted protection from Native American attack, as their settlements had promoted conflict. But the settlers didn't know who to turn to for this military protection. There was no United States Army, and North Carolina wasn't sure about its intentions, let alone its obligations. So John Sevier, who you see pictured on the screen, and 49 others organized their own government for their own common defense. Sevier had been a captain in the Virginia militia, and he was one of the early Watauga settlers in what is today eastern Tennessee, which they leased from Cherokee leaders. The Jonesboro crew applied for statehood in 1785. Had it gone through, this would be a very different place today. Sevier named the new state Franklin. Can you imagine living in the state of Franklin instead of the state of Tennessee today in 2021? Sevier wrote a letter to the famous founding father for his support. Benjamin Franklin and the United States government did not support the new state, but 10,000 families from Virginia and North Carolina moved into the region because they were bolstered by the military protection Sevier promised them. Sevier never stopped fighting against Native Americans. He spent most of his life in conflict with indigenous people. Sevier even sought military support from Spain before he admitted that the Franklin experiment was over in 1788. That same year, 1788, witnessed the second birth of a new nation. 1 year before, leading American politicians called for a convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to address problems such as who could own what land in the backcountry and what protocols should be put in place to admit new states to the Union. American leaders such as James Madison and John Adams and our own William Blount ended up creating an entirely new constitution for a new system of government. The states ratified the Constitution in 1788. The Constitution empowered the new federal government to regulate settlement in Western lands. The Constitution further authorized the federal government to make treaties with Native Americans. While some American leaders were meeting at the Constitutional Convention to create a new federal government, other members of Congress passed an important new law that governed the process by which Western territories became states. Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. I want you all to remember that. If I put you to sleep so far, wake up. And if you're out there in internet land, get a piece of pencil, get a piece of paper and a pencil and write this down. If you want to understand Tennessee statehood and the process by which Tennessee went from becoming from a territory to a state, you have to understand the Northwest Territory and the laws governing the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. The ordinance was separate from the Constitution, but the new federal government adhered to this legal precedent. The ordinance established 3 stages for bringing lands in this northwestern region into the United States. 3 stages. It's going to be at the quiz at the end of this. In the first stage, settlers were allowed to move west on their own. But Congress then determined when and where a territory was formed. The ordinance gave power to Congress to appoint a territorial governor, a secretary, and 3 judges to make laws for a territory. The territory entered the second stage once it had a population of 5,000 white male landowners. At this point, those 5,000 men could elect a legislative assembly. The assembly could then choose a council. The assembly and council could pass laws, but the territorial governor that Congress appointed could veto anything. The Northwest Ordinance was a federalist policy aimed at strengthening the power of the federal government. Once a territory had 60,000 white male landowners, it could apply to the federal government to become a state. The territory could not fully govern itself. It could not elect its own governor and be somewhat free of federal control until it became a state. This law was meant for the Northwest Territory, but it became the model for all other territories west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi River. The United States government didn't have much revenue. It didn't have an army or a navy. And so there were American politicians such as George Washington, our first president, who did not want costly wars with Native Americans in the Western lands that the United States acquired from winning the Revolutionary War. Washington and other Federalists wanted to compromise. Despite his own complex past with indigenous people, Washington believed Native Americans needed to be treated as foreign nations with their own land rights. He believed the United States government was obligated to pay for land that Americans wanted from Native Americans. Of course, indigenous peoples preferred to keep all of that land. This land was, after all, their home. Other American leaders, such as Philip Schuyler, a New York senator and former general in the Continental Army, wanted conflict. And when I say they wanted conflict, that sounds bad. This man wanted conflict. Yes, he wanted conflict. There were people who wanted to kill indigenous peoples, and Philip Schuyler is one of them. Schuyler famously stated that indigenous people, in his own words, must retire further back and dispose of their lands until they dwindle to nothing. End quote. In short, while some American leaders advocated forcing Native Americans into an early grave, others promoted forcing them to a bargaining table to get more of their land. In either case, the plan was for westward expansion and the plan was for indigenous removal. There was not going to be an American proclamation line. William Blount was one of the central figures involved in turning Cherokee country into Tennessee. And I hope we get more people studying the history of William Blount. He's not just a central figure in this local region. He's a central figure in terms of westward expansion, in terms of setting a precedent for all of this. President Washington and Secretary of War Henry Knox appointed Blount as governor of the newly formed Southwest Territory in 1790 as thanks for being a loyal Federalist during the constitutional debates. Blount had helped North Carolina ratify the Constitution. As a territorial governor, Blount was supposed to support the interests of the federal government in the region. Blount was also appointed Superintendent of Indian Affairs in the South. Washington and Knox expected Blount, a fellow Federalist, to work to prevent costly wars with neighboring Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Creek nations. Blount may have been a Federalist, but unlike Washington, he supported westward expansion at all costs. While Washington had been a surveyor and he had speculated in some Western lands, Blount was an even greater land speculator, one of the greatest land speculators, largest land speculators in all of North America. Blount was born and raised in North Carolina. Don't forget, that was a state that claimed all the land in this region. It shouldn't surprise you then that people from North Carolina settled in this area, including Blount. Blount had been a land speculator and a politician in North Carolina. He used his position as a member of North Carolina's government to get legal title to over 1 million acres of land in what is today East Tennessee. But he wanted more. I tell some of my students that I grew up on 3 acres in Pennsylvania, and I never want to have to mow more than 3 acres of land in my life. I can't imagine owning over 1 million acres of land in East Tennessee. Can you imagine? That's a lot of land. That's a lot of land. But he wanted more. Land speculators everywhere wanted more Western land to sell to settlers to make more money. Blount first established his headquarters for the Southwest Territory in the home of William Cobb in Washington County near the Watauga River. Cobb called his home Rocky Mount. John Sevier was the commander of the Washington County militia that protected Rocky Mount. At this point, the terms of the Northwest Ordinance meant that the federal government was in control of the region. But Blount was their point man on the ground. There wasn't even a legislature in the Southwest Territory, and this was strange. The region had enough white male landowners to establish an assembly and a council as early as 1791. But Blount did not submit the paperwork to the federal government for another 2 years. While the statehood process was delayed, Washington ordered Blount to meet with the Cherokee to solidify a peace treaty in 1791. Blount was supposed to do 2 things with the Treaty of Holston, and that should ring some bells to some of you out here. Those of you keeping notes, Treaty of Holston, 1791. Blount was supposed to do 2 things. Washington wanted him to confirm the 1785 treaty and wanted him to confirm that the Cherokee were willing to pay for lands that people had accidentally settled on, didn't really know what they were doing, but they're on Cherokee lands in violation of previous treaties. And would the Cherokee please allow these good people to buy their land and give the Cherokee money? At the Treaty of Holston near James White's fort, Blount ignored Washington's policy and insisted that the Cherokee were a conquered people who lost all rights to their lands. And I implore you all, I don't have time to go into it now, but please look at the history of the Treaty of Holston. The spectacle that Blount created that right near here, I mean, those of you familiar with this history, the things that were done are just extraordinary. Instead of paying the Cherokee what they wanted for their land, Blount only agreed to an annual stipend of $1,000 in federal funds if the Cherokee agreed to cede all claims to the region east of the Clinch River, north of a line through Kingston to the North Carolina border, and if they agreed to allow settlers the full use of the Tennessee River. And that's a big deal full use of the Tennessee River. I mean, those of you in the Vol Navy in this room, those of you in the Vol Navy out there, you know the Tennessee River is super important. Then Blount relocated his office to an area he named Knoxville in 1792 in an effort to get back in the good graces of Secretary Knox, President Washington, and the other Federalists. Younger Cherokee and Creek warriors attacked settlements in the region throughout 1792 because of the terms of the Treaty of Holston. They felt Blount and their elders had conspired against them. Washington and the federal government refused to help. They had sent Blount to prevent this situation, and Washington was angry with Blount. Settlers took matters into their own hands and raided Cherokee and Creek towns. In the midst of this conflict, all this is going on. The first full General Assembly of the Southwest Territory met in Knoxville on August 26, 1794. This was the second stage in the process of statehood. On June 29, 1795, the Assembly voted to check the population in the area to see if there was enough white male landowners to move to stage 3. The Assembly expected things to move forward, so they further recommended that Blount call for 5 delegates from each of the 11 counties in the territory to a constitutional convention. Already, people were thinking about Tennessee's first constitution. The results of the census came in on November 28, 1795. There were over 77,000 white male landowners in the region, well over the required 60,000 to pursue statehood. So Blount officially called for the Constitutional Convention to meet right here in Knoxville on January 11th, 1796. This is the Constitution that the convention adopted for the state of Tennessee. I don't know if you can all read this even here in the room or home, but it says, "We the people of the territory of the United States, south of the river Ohio." Do you all think of yourself as the people living south of the Ohio River? That's line. A man here said that's Kentucky. That's the first line in our state constitution. The Constitution did not ban slavery in this region. And that was somewhat controversial for 1796. Some of you who have in mind the history of the Civil War and the 18th century as this old-timey, far away place, right, where people did a whole bunch of things that we wouldn't do today, and we can't judge them for that. There are people in 1796 who wanted to ban slavery in these Western lands. This isn't Chris Magara up here telling you what I would like to be true, what I would hope would have been true. You understand? The Northwest Territory had banned slavery, right? We got all those Western lands that the United States acquired after the Revolutionary War, right? We acquired all of that land. The Northwest Territory, slavery is banned there. Thomas Jefferson, maybe some of you might know him, wanted to ban slavery in the Southwest Territory. Not out of some noble, high-minded ideals. Jefferson had in mind that we would keep these Western lands for white landowners and didn't want to see anything else creep into these Western lands. Also, tobacco markets had busted in the 1790s. Anyone in here know who our chief trading partner was for selling tobacco? No, it was not Spain. It had been England, and they were still mad at us for that whole revolution thing, right? It's interesting, though, that a lot of that tobacco was re-exported from England to France. And I think I'd love to see somebody write a history on this, but I think we got France addicted to our tobacco. That's one of the reasons they allied with us in the Revolutionary War. I'd like to see somebody do some research on that. Tobacco markets had busted. Slave labor had become expensive. And there was a feeling in a lot of different places that slavery is on its way out in the 1790s. But Tennessee leaders believed plantation agriculture and slave labor represented the future for the state in 1796. Eli Whitney had just patented his cotton gin, after all. Tennessee legislators did compromise in one area in the new Constitution, religion. Tennessee's founding fathers did not make this a Christian state founded by Christians for Christians. Whenever I go on the radio talking about the Constitution, Jack, maybe you get this too. People call in and want to know, were the founding fathers Christians? And man, that's tough. That's hard. I mean, I go to church on Sundays and I don't know if the person sitting next to me is a Christian. That's hard. Tennessee's founding fathers did not make this a Christian state, founded by Christians for Christians. They could have, but they did not want the new state to be a haven for atheists. So they forged a middle path. They prohibited religious leaders from getting elected to the upper or lower house in the state legislature. And they did not mention Jesus Christ or heaven anywhere in the Constitution. Jack, you correct me if I'm wrong on that. JC's nowhere in our state constitution. At the same time, they made it illegal for anyone who denied, quote, the being of God. And that's the phraseology in our Constitution, the being of God, or a future state of rewards and punishment, end quote, from holding any elected office in the state. So you deny those things, the being of God, you can't hold elected office in the state of Tennessee. The new state constitution also incorporated a direct response to Cherokee and Creek resistance to westward expansion. To be clear, indigenous people influenced the contours of Tennessee's first constitution. If indigenous people didn't resist westward expansion, then this part of the Constitution would not have existed. Article 11, Section 31 declared that settlers in Tennessee were, quote unquote, entitled to the right of preemption and occupancy in an area that Cherokee and Creek still claimed. We call this squatters' rights today. The Tennessee Constitution essentially said that if settlers settled in Cherokee or Creek country, then that act of settlement converted the ownership of land from indigenous people to the settlers. And in the event that the land had never been surveyed before by a land speculation company, then the squatters had the right to preempt anyone else informally purchasing the land from the state of Tennessee if it ever came to that. This provision promoted westward real estate speculation, development, and settlement, and it virtually ensured future conflict with indigenous people in our region. Blount and the Territorial Assembly were not acting by the strict protocols established in the Northwest Ordinance. Those of you taking careful notes on this need to be saying, bells need to be going off, and need to be ringing, saying, where's the federal government in all this, Dr. Magra? You said the Northwest Ordinance established this precedent? Yeah, I did say that. If you all forgot about it, President Washington did not forget about it. They were supposed to get approval from the federal government before moving ahead with the Constitutional Convention. Remember, the Federalists were at the height of their power. They had just gotten the Constitution ratified by the states. Blount, ever ambitious, wanted to adopt a Constitution, elect officials, and then submit the whole package to the federal government. So that's what they did on February 6, 1796. They approved the new Constitution right here in Knoxville, and they settled on the state's new name, Tennessee. John Sevier was elected as the first governor. Blount and Andrew Jackson were elected to represent Tennessee in the nation's capital. as senator and congressman, respectively. Blount even went so far as to publicly declare that the Southwest Territory, in his words, has terminated. That's Blount standing up and publicly telling the federal government, this thing's over. I ended it. Y'all see the problem here? All this local authority, all the state power rubbed Federalists, including President Washington and Secretary of War Henry Knox, the wrong way. They had worked hard to establish the new federal constitution as the law of the land. Federalists saw Blount and the Tennessee Assembly as subverting the power of the new federal government. When the United States Congress took up the issue of admitting Tennessee to the Union in May 1796, Federalists opposed the plan. Congressmen were only supposed to check to make sure the new state constitutions broadly upheld American ideals, and this was supposed to be mostly symbolic. But Congress debated the issue of Tennessee's statehood for 2 months. This opposition rubbed Blount the wrong way, and he became an ardent anti-federalist and a staunch defender of states' rights. Even though we did not have formal political parties in this country, party politics still influenced decision-making in our national government. And when Congress did approve Tennessee's admission as a 16th state in the Union on June 1st, 1796, the very last day Congress was in session, that's why we're celebrating it this month. Federalists reduced Tennessee's electoral votes and forced Tennesseans to re-elect their senators and re-elect their congressmen as a final punishment. This conflict between states' rights and federal authority would define westward expansion in the United States up to the Civil War. And I want to leave you with the image of a tree. If you can't see, that is a tree there, I promise you. We can imagine that it's a tulip tree, which was named the state tree of Tennessee in 1947. Knoxville's roots run deep. Many people's decisions watered those roots. There have been a lot of conflicts and compromises in this region. The 225th anniversary gives us a moment to pause and reflect on those conflicts and those compromises. The anniversary of statehood should force us to remember Tennessee's roots, and it should get us thinking about how we want to grow over the next quarter of a millennium. Thank you all for your time. I look forward to your questions.